Hello, everyone, and I hope everybody's having a great time at the ML Summit this year. My name is Justin, and I'm going to be talking to you about creating inclusive classroom libraries. All right, so here are our objectives for this brief presentation. First, we're going to explain why diversity and inclusion is important in books and in libraries. And we're going to explore a couple of ways to vet books as well to ensure that your libraries are of the highest quality. And we won't be practicing, but I'll show you how to use lenses to understand different perspectives and stories so we can actually practice talking about the themes in these books. But before that, I'd like to share with you a little bit about myself. I am originally from Arizona, US, and I live in Thailand with my husband, Barack, and our dog, Boomer. And I am non-binary, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs. This is a picture of where I live in Chiang Mai, northern Thailand. And this is where I teach first grade, and next year I will be starting the ELL program at my school. So before we dig in a little bit, I'd like to share with you a really powerful message from Professor Rudine Sims-Bishop about, she makes this analogy about how books are windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors. So take a listen. Woo. Let's see.
We need diverse books because we need books in which children can find themselves, see reflections of themselves. I wrote a piece, maybe 1990 it was published, which I called Mirrors, Windows, and Sliding Glass Doors. And I think that's really why children need to see themselves reflected, but books can also be windows, and so you can look through and see other worlds and see how they match up or don't match up to your own. But the sliding glass door allows you to enter that world as well. And so that's the reason that the diversity needs to go both ways. I mean, it's not just children who have been underrepresented and marginalized who need these books. It's also the children who always find their mirrors in the books and therefore get an exaggerated sense of their own self-worth and a false sense of what the world is like, because it's becoming more and more colorful and diverse as time goes on. So I think that's why.
All right, and here's a little like a graphic to kind of further explain that. I think her message is very powerful because, yeah, when books are mirrors, we can see our lives and our identities reflected in the books that we read. And they can offer different perspectives to show other people's identities and other people's, worlds. But they also, in our classrooms, especially me being an international teacher in our classrooms already are so diverse with lots of different people from lots of different backgrounds. Diverse books can really give us an opportunity to enter other people's worlds and see things from their perspectives as well. And I'd like to show you, though, some data about the publishing industry before we dig deeper. Lee and Low Books surveyed the biggest publishers in the US in 2015. Here we go. And they surveyed the publish industry to see, what lenses really consist of in the publishing industry. And they discovered in 2015 that, as you can see from this data, that most of the publishing industry is white, cis, straight, heterosexual women and able-bodied women. The results were pretty astounding, right? And they conducted another survey in 2019 to see if the landscape has changed at all. And as you can see from this data, not much has changed. So with that being said, if this is what the publishing industry looks like, it reflects also the books that are being published. You know, there's really a dominant mirror that we can see, right? And you know, that can have a lot of negative impacts on our students in our classrooms. So we're really only getting one perspective, or we're getting a very clearly a very dominant perspective. And here's a quote by Danielle Ado from diversebooks.org. It's important that marginalized children aren't the only ones reading and being exposed to diverse books, nor are their lives the only ones that will be enriched by reading them. But reading books that represent different abilities and cultures and beliefs and skin colors can help us change our attitude towards the differences, those differences. So that kind of gives you some insight as to why diversity is important. And so we're going to just talk about two ways, you know, we can vet the books in our libraries to make sure that the books that we are using are as diverse and inclusive as possible. And vetting books is really important, right? It ensures that our reading materials are really high quality, right? And respectful towards our students. And they contain positive and diverse themes and messages. And, you know, some books that we may read are implicitly and often explicitly problematic or biased in theme, which means that we might have to let go of some of the classics, in quotes, right, that we're used to reading and may not know that the themes in them are harmful. So here's some examples of that, right? Some Dr. Seuss books are really popular in early elementary classes, but they do present a lot of problematic racist themes that are really harmful for students and provide a very specific perspective that's harmful. And then books like The Indian in the Cupboard and Peter Pan also represent like Native American people, Indigenous people in really problematic ways that aren't accurate in the world that we live in. But then there's also books that market themselves as being inclusive or diverse, but really kind of miss the mark. For example, this graphic novel on the bottom, Stonewall, is about the Stonewall uprisings in 1969 in June, and that led to queer and gay liberation, right? But this graphic novel kind of centers this white gay male perspective, when really the Stonewall riots were started by Black trans women, and they led the movement, right? So really this book is kind of offering an inaccurate lens and perspective. And then this book up at the top, Be Who You Are, has a lot of representations of different families and genders and sexualities and things like that. But often, as especially elementary teachers, we kind of gravitate towards non-realistic characters and maybe even animals to depict diversity. But really, we should be centering stories of actual people, not aliens or penguins. You know, those are nice to include in our libraries, but we really need to be intentional about centering real people and real stories. So what does this mean for our students, especially our language learners, right? I'll read this quote to you. It's actually two quotes in one. Texts and textbooks are not neutral resources. They carry encoded in their pages institutionalized and legitimized views of appropriate behavior and acceptable identities. It is these codified stances that can impact English language learners' readers' sense of possible selves, or the identity positions which an individual can reasonably see themselves inhabiting. right? So when we're being bombarded with all of these messages and these coded messages over time, right, our childhood and all of the time we spend in school, it really helps shape our identity. But if we're just reading books and studying text from a single perspective, it's really limiting our possible sense of selves, right? And I use these two websites to vet a lot of the books that I read to my students in order for my school. Book Toss by Dr. Laura Jimenez and Raising Luminaries by Ashia Ray. They're incredible websites. I talk about them all the time. So check them out for some great resources in vetting books. We're going to skip this bit. Now, when we're vetting books, you might realize that some of the books that you like and some of the books that you read may contain a lot of problematic themes. And especially if you're cis and white, you might feel a little defensiveness rise up, right? Just like what Professor Bishop says, if we're just used to our own mirror being reflected, it kind of conflates our sense of self, right? So yes, you might get some feelings of defensiveness, and that's okay, right? Acknowledge it, but really stop and listen to these perspectives that are being shared and make changes. It's not that you're intentionally doing something that's harmful. We just may not know what we're doing is harmful. So it's important to realize that and make changes to our behavior and our instructional practice to better our learners. So I'm going to show you a strategy that I use to have active conversations about the diverse and inclusive books in our libraries, right? Because just having them available and just reading them to the class as like a read aloud isn't enough. We need to actively be having conversations about these books and really digging deep into those themes. So I use this strategy of different lenses, right? And lenses are critical approaches to reading and understanding texts and viewing and understanding different perspectives, right? And think of it as like a camera lens that you can change on your camera, and you use different lenses in different situations. So the same goes for reading, right? We use different lenses and when we read for different situations to help us better understand the text. So some lenses that we can use include, but are not limited to, lenses of racism, privilege, colonialism. Using these lenses can really help us think about stories in different ways and engage our students in critical thinking and active conversations. I use a lot of sentences or sentence stems when I'm considering, engaging discussions. These are some of the sentences that I use and some of the questions I ask my students to kind of pull some of their background and some of their knowledge. Some of them are like, how would you feel if, or what would you do if? Using these sentence stems can help guide you in having conversations with our students. And here are some examples, right? How would you feel if someone bullied you because your parents were different, right? What would you do if you saw someone being made fun of for what they looked like, for the way that they looked? These can help our students really engage in the text instead of just passively listening and passively absorbing information. So here's some books that I've read in my class. I love Little People, Big Dream Stories. One of our class favorites is about Josephine Baker, who was a queer dancer in the 1920s. In this book, we kind of extrapolated a lot of conversations about racism and feminism, because those are all tied into this book. And I Dissent, the story of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, has a lot of different lenses that you can use for racism, feminism, and privilege. And one of these, we had actually a really great conversation with my students about this story, because we talked a lot about racism by reading like the book about Josephine Baker, but then in this book, I Dissent, it talks about how Ruth Bader Ginsburg was also subjected to a lot of prejudice because she's Jewish, right? And the kids were really kind of perplexed by that because they thought, oh, well, she's white. Why are people being prejudiced towards her? So we talked about how racism also extends to religion, and also the privilege that some people have with being white or lighter skin. So, you can keep engaging in those conversations. And as soon as you start having them, more conversations are going to naturally come up because the kids are just going to be more knowledgeable and more aware. And this book, we read Tomas and the Library Lady. We talked a lot about privilege because Tomas is a migrant worker from Mexico, from Latin America. And he has to travel from Texas to Iowa every summer to go to work. And we talked about immigration, and we also talked about white saviorism, because in this story, it kind of centers the library lady, this white woman who kind of like helps Tomas. But actually, Tomas helps himself in a lot of different ways. So instead, we centered his perspective instead of centering the library lady's perspective, right? We really focused and dug deep into Tomas. And this book was actually in our curriculum, so I had to teach this book. But then I incorporated different stories that tied into this one that have similar themes, right? I'll talk about those in a second. But as you're reading texts, and as I read texts, I use Lorena German's anti-racism reading instruction workbook to help kind of guide me into thinking about different themes and conversations to have with the kids. And as I'm selecting texts to read, I'm asking a lot of these questions to myself. Does that voice represent the dominant ideals in our culture, or what perspectives are missing, and how is it impacting the plot or the characters or the conflict? So like in Tomas, his perspective was missing. Instead, it was a lot of the white library lady's perspective. So again, we shifted we centered his perspective instead of hers, because his is a lot more important. And one other question is, how does issues of race and ethnicity and identity directly or indirectly present themselves in the text? So her workbook is incredible. I would highly recommend it. And it's like 40 or 50 pages. You can buy it online. And it has really helped transform the way I think about my teaching. And after we read Tomas and the Library Lady, I read these 3 books, 2 of which I already had in my library in school. 2 White Rabbits and The Wall in the Middle of this book, and The Journey. And they're all about immigration and have a common theme of walls and borders, right? So we read these books, we talked a lot about immigration and walls and why people have to leave, and how a lot of people are escaping war or violence or looking for new opportunities, right? And then as sort of a culminating activity, considering what I learned from Lorena's book, or her anti-racism workbook, I thought of, right, I asked the students, how would the story have changed if these walls and if these barriers that are common themes in each book, what if they weren't there? How would the characters' lives and stories change? And I had the kids draw some pictures. Here's one, and they got to pick a story and draw a picture of what would happen if the wall didn't exist. And in this case, the ogre and the man would have been friends, and there would never be a flood to begin with, because in The Wall in the Middle of this book, there's a flood, because there's a wall that's blocking water. And this student drew a picture of how, there wouldn't be a problem if there was no wall. Again, there was a flood, and if there was no wall, there would be no flood. The student drew about the journey and how if the mom and her children were able to enter the new country and pass this border, if the border wasn't there, they'd be able to live a happy life. Another student added some text to it about how they would also live a happy life if there was no wall or barrier keeping them out. This student wrote about 2 white rabbits and drew a picture about how the little girl could go to school if there was no wall or barrier that kept her from entering a safer place. So you can really engage in a lot of different discussions and kind of extend what you're already doing just by asking some simple questions and really get the kids thinking, right? So we went through all 3 of our objectives, and That's it for today, everyone. Here's some of my sources. There we go. And that I used. And I hope this presentation was helpful for you and helped getting you thinking about how you can not only include diverse and inclusive books in your library, but how to actively utilize them, right? So I'd love for you to take some time to scan this QR code. It'll take you to a Google form just for reflection and just some feedback from me, right? You can also find me at justingarcia.ell.com or on Twitter at crew_Justin. And I also co-facilitate hashtag queer edu chat. And I talk a lot about how queer identity and themes intersect with education. All right, well, that's all I have for you. I hope you enjoy the rest of the summit, and I look forward to connecting with you all soon. Bye, thank you.